Chapter 2 Popular Cultures, Ordinary Language. To leave Vienna or Cambridge, to leave theoretical texts, is not to leave Wittgenstein behind. He was a teacher in a village elementary school between 1920 and 1926, but rather to set out toward the open sea of common experience that surrounds, penetrates, and finally carries away every discourse, if one is not satisfied with substituting a political mastery for scientific appropriation. Memories come back to me, the places of these mute silences of memory. For instance, as an introduction to a seminar on the popular culture of northeast Brazil, a walk through the night, alive with sound, in the town of Salvador, towards the Igreja do Passo, contrasting with the subtle theatricality of the Misericordia, the church's dark facade lifts up into its dignity all the dust and sweat of the city. Standing above the old parts of town full of vague murmurings and human voices, it presents their monumental, silent secret. It dominates the narrow Ladieira do Passo. It does not yield itself to researchers who nevertheless have it there before them, just as popular language escapes them when they approach it, for it comes from too far away and too high. Very different from the Church do Rosario, which is all blue and openness. This dark stone raises the nocturnal face of Bahian irony. An unconquerable rock, even though, or because, it is familiar, totally without solemnity, similar to the songs of the Brazilian Saudade. Returning from this pilgrimage, the passing faces in the street seem, in spite of their vivacious mobility, to multiply the indecipherable and nearby secret of the monument. A Brazilian art. Our investigation moves on, groping its way, as we did, in interdisciplinary local teams, in Rio, in Salvador, and in Recife, Brazil, or again in Santiago and Concepcion, Chile, in Posadas, Argentina, etc. For example, one of these analyses concerned the language used by the peasants of the Pernambuco, in Crato, Juazeiro, Itapetim, etc. In talking about their situation in 1974 and about the great deeds of Fray Damião, the charismatic hero of the region. The discourse parted space in such a way as to stratify it on two levels. On the one hand, a socio-economic space, organized by an immemorial struggle between the powerful and the poor, presented itself as the field of constant victories by the rich and the police, but also as the reign of mendacity. There no truth is said, except in whispers and among peasants. Agora a gente sabe, mas não pode dizer alto. In this space, the strong always win and words always deceive, an experience in accord with that of a Maghrebian syndicalist in Billancourt. They always fuck us over. On the other hand, distinct from this polymological space, which perspicacious country people saw as a network of innumerable conflicts covered up with words, there was also a utopian space in which a possibility, by definition miraculous in nature, was affirmed by religious stories. Fray Damião was the almost immobile center of this space, constantly qualified by the successive accounts of the celestial punishments visited upon his enemies. As far as the actual power relationships were concerned, we can say that a lucid discourse cunningly turned up fake words and prohibitions on speaking in order to reveal an ubiquitous injustice, not simply the injustice of the established powers, but, more profoundly, that of history. It recognized in that injustice an order of things that seemed immutable. It is always so. People see it every day. But no legitimacy whatever was accorded this state of affairs. On the contrary, just because it was a constantly repeated fact, this relationship of forces did not become any more acceptable. The fact was not accepted as a law, even if it remained inescapably a fact. trapped in dependency, forced to submit to the facts, this conviction is nevertheless opposed to the statutory fact of an order presenting itself as natural, a goal of non-acceptance, and to its fatality, an ethical protest. If science can permit itself different options concerning the relation between facts and laws, it is above all because it can escape from that dependence. But in order to affirm the non-coincidence of fact and meaning, another scene was required, the religious scene, that reintroduces, in the mode of supernatural events, the historical contingency of this nature and, by means of celestial landmarks, creates a place for this protest. The unacceptability of an order which is nevertheless established was articulated, appropriately enough, as a miracle. There, in a language necessarily foreign to the analysis of socioeconomic relationships, the hope could be maintained that the vanquished of history, the body on which the victories of the rich or their allies are continually inscribed, might, in the person of the humiliated saint, Damião, rise again as a result of the blows rained on its adversaries from on high. Without diminishing in any way what one sees every day, the stories of miracles respond to it from aside, with irrelevance and impertinence, in a different discourse. A discourse one can only believe, just as an ethical reaction must believe that life cannot be reduced to what one sees of it. In the same way, in J.L. Comolli's film La Sicilia, the anarchist songs form the counterpoint to the events that gradually destroy, as it develops, the socialist commune founded in Brazil by Tito Rossi. The song remains intact and, in the end, from the very ruins of a history restored to order, these songs rise again, escaping from the battlefield of defeat, lifting up a voice that will bring to life, elsewhere, other movements. Uni dia l'amante mia, a cui dette braccio e cor. An idea is my darling, I gave it grip and heart. De ta fretta a sorgere, o sol del avenir, vivere vogliam liberi, non vogliam più servir. Ah, hurry to rise, you son of the future. It's free we would live, we would serve no more. In the same way as the voodoo loas, the spirits and voices from another realm, the stories of miracles are also songs, but serious ones, relating not to uprisings but to the recognition of the permanent repression. In spite of everything, they provide the possible with a site that is impregnable, because it is a nowhere, a utopia. They create another space which coexists with that of an experience deprived of illusions. They tell a truth, the miraculous, which is not reducible to the particular beliefs that serve it as metaphors or symbols. They exist alongside the analysis of facts, as the equivalent of what a political ideology introduces into that analysis. The rural believers thus subvert the fatality of the established order, and they do it by using a frame of reference which also proceeds from an external power, the religion imposed by Christian missions. They re-employ a system that, far from being their own, has been constructed and spread by others, and they mark this re-employment by superstitions, excrescences of this belief in miracles, which civil and religious authorities have always correctly suspected of putting in question the reason behind power and knowledge hierarchies. A popular use of religion modifies its functioning. A way of speaking this received language transforms it into a song of resistance, but this internal metamorphosis does not in any way compromise the sincerity with which it may be believed, nor the lucidity with which, from another point of view, the struggles and inequalities hidden under the established order may be perceived. More generally, a way of using imposed systems constitutes the resistance to the historical law of a state of affairs and its dogmatic legitimations. A practice of the order constructed by others redistributes its space. It creates at least a certain play in that order, a space for maneuvers of unequal forces and for utopian points of reference. That is where the opacity of a popular culture could be said to manifest itself, a dark rock that resists all assimilation. What is there called wisdom, sabedoria, may be defined as a stratagem, trampolinagum, which a play on words associates with the acrobatics of the mountebank and his art of jumping on the trampoline, trampolim, and as trickery, trapaceria, ruse, deception, in the way one uses or cheats with the terms of social contracts. Innumerable ways of playing and foiling the other's game, jouer, déjouer le jeu de l'autre, that is, the space instituted by others, characterize the subtle, stubborn, resistant activity of groups which, since they lack their own space, have to get along in a network of already established forces and representations. People have to make do with what they have. In these combatants' stratagems, there is a certain art of placing one's blows, a pleasure in getting around the rules of a constraining space. We see the tactical and joyful dexterity of the mastery of a technique. Scapin and Figaro are only literary echoes of this art. Like the skill of a driver in the streets of Rome or Naples, there is a skill that has its connoisseurs and its aesthetics exercised in any labyrinth of powers, a skill ceaselessly recreating opacities and ambiguities, spaces of darkness and trickery, in the universe of technocratic transparency, a skill that disappears into them and reappears again, taking no responsibility for the administration of a totality. Even the field of misfortune is refashioned by this combination of manipulation and enjoyment. The proverbial enunciation. Is this too hasty a generalization? It is a hypothesis for research, to be sure, but it is based on the examinations of other terrains, and situated, naturally, in an ensemble of precedents and neighboring inquiries. For example, the recent research on the practical intelligence, métis, of the Greeks, or on the practical sense and the strategies of the peoples of Béarn in southern France and Kabylia in North Africa. This approach to popular culture takes its inspiration from a problematics of enunciation in the triple sense due to Austin's analysis of performative utterances, to A.J. Greimas's semiotics of manipulation, and to the semiology of the Prague school. Although it was initially concerned with the speech act, through which a speaker actualizes and appropriates his mother tongue in a particular situation of exchange or contract, this problematics can be extended to culture as a whole on the basis of the resemblance between the enunciative procedures which articulate actions in both the field of language and the network of social practices. It differs from more traditional studies concerned with legendary, proverbial, etc. statements, or more generally, with the objective form of rites or behaviors, in that it constitutes a corpus peculiar to popular culture and analyzes the variable terms of invariable functions with finite systems. The postulates and methods of the two perspectives are divergent. Whereas the one seeks to discern the types of operations for which historical conjunctures provide the space, the other prefers to identify the structural equilibria whose constancy each society manifests in differing ways. The differences are, of course, neither so simple nor so antithetical. Thus, Pierre Bourdieu combines both in a theory of practice, to which we shall have to return. But one can clarify what is at stake in these alternatives by reference to a particular case, that of the proverb. One method consists in first isolating proverbs and then collecting them, as Aarne or Propp did for folktales. Once the material has been collected, one can treat either the content, divided by labels or semantic units, actions, themes, agents, whose relationships are analyzable in terms of structures, and whose aggregates indicate the mental geography peculiar to a given group. Or one can study the modes of production, for example, the way in which proverbs, generally distichs, out of sight, out of mind, when the cat's away, the mice will play, red sky in morning, sailor take warning, etc., reinforce the impact of the meaning by diminishing differences in sound, through rhyme, alliteration, etc. On the one hand, one is concerned with systems of signification, on the other with systems of fabrication. Through a twofold control of the corpus they circumscribe and of the operations they carry out on it, These methods succeed in defining their object themselves. What is a proverb? In rationalizing its collection, in classifying the types, and transforming the given into something reproducible. For example, if one knows the rules of the production of proverbs, one can fabricate a series of them. These techniques thus provide, by explaining them, the ability to construct social phenomena, just as biology synthesizes insulin. Because the analysis of myths has been further developed than that of proverbs, such analysis, from Aarne to Lévi-Strauss, has shown how a science of these discourses, by isolating and sifting them, by refining and formalizing the minimum units it treats, can classify literature that is supposed to be heterogeneous, can reveal a savage mind, pensée sauvage, and a logic in bodies of material constituted as foreign, and, in this way, can renew the interpretation and production of our own discourse. The drawback of this method, which is at the same time the condition of its success, is that it extracts the documents from their historical context and eliminates the operations of speakers in particular situations of time, place, and competition. Everyday linguistic practices, as well as the space of their tactics, have to be ignored in order for the scientific practices to be able to operate in their own field. The innumerable tricks of bringing in a proverb at just the right moment, and with a particular interlocutor, are thus not taken into account. This art and its practitioners are excluded from the laboratory, not only because the scientific method requires a delimitation and simplification of its objects, but also because there corresponds to the constitution of a scientific space, as the precondition of any analysis, the necessity of being able to transfer the objects of study into it. Only what can be transported can be treated. What cannot be uprooted remains by definition outside the field of research. Hence the privilege that these studies accord to discourses, the data that can most easily be grasped, recorded, transported, and examined in secure places. In contrast, the speech act cannot be parted from its circumstances. Of the practices themselves, science will retain only movable elements, tools and products to be put in display cases, or descriptive schemas, quantifiable behaviors, stereotypes of the staging of social intercourse, ritual structures, leaving aside the aspects of a society that cannot be so uprooted and transferred to another space, ways of using things or words according to circumstances. Something essential is at work in this everyday historicity, which cannot be disassociated from the existence of the subjects who are the agents and authors of conjunctural operations. Indeed, like Schreber's God, who communicates only with cadavers, our knowledge seems to consider and tolerate in a social body only inert objects. Was it fate? I remember the marvelous Shelburne Museum in Vermont, where, in 35 houses of a reconstructed village, all the signs, tools, and products of 19th century everyday life teem. Everything from cooking utensils and pharmaceutical goods to weaving instruments, toilet articles, and children's toys can be found in profusion. The display includes innumerable familiar objects, polished, deformed, or made more beautiful by long use. Everywhere there are as well the marks of the active hands and laboring or patient bodies for which these things compose the daily circuits, the fascinating presence of absences whose traces were everywhere. At least, this village full of abandoned and salvaged objects drew one's attention, through them, to the ordered murmurs of 100 past or possible villages, and by means of these imbricated traces, one began to dream of countless combinations of existences. Like tools, proverbs, and other discourses are marked by uses. They offer to analysis the imprints of acts or of processes of enunciation. They signify the operations whose object they have been, operations which are relative to situations, and which can be thought of as the conjunctural modalizations of statements or of practices. More generally, they thus indicate a social historicity in which systems of representations or processes of fabrication no longer appear only as normative frameworks, but also as tools manipulated by users. Logics, games, tales, and the arts of speaking. From these imprints on language, we are already returning toward operators' ways of operating. But it is not enough to describe individual ruses and devices. In order to think them, one must suppose that to these ways of operating correspond a finite number of procedures. Invention is not unlimited, and, like improvisations on the piano or on the guitar, it presupposes the knowledge and application of codes, and that they imply a logic of the operation of actions relative to types of situations. This logic, which turns on circumstances, has as its precondition, contrary to the procedures of Western science, the non-autonomy of its field of action. A rich elucidation of this logic can be found in Chinese thought, in the canonical I Ching, or Book of Changes, or in Sun Tzu's Art of War, or in the Arab tradition of the Book of Tricks. But need we seek our models so far abroad? Every society always manifests somewhere the formal rules which its practices obey. But where should we look for them in the West, since our scientific method, by substituting its own places for the complex geography of social ruses and its artificial languages for ordinary language, has allowed and even required reason to adopt a logic of mastery and transparency? Like Poe's purloined letter, the inscriptions of these various logics are written in places so obvious that one does not see them. Without referring again to ordinary language, we can already suggest 3 places in which, hidden only by their very evidence, the formal rules of these circumstantial ways of making are already visible. First of all, in the specific games of each society, games which as operations are disjunctive, because they produce differentiating events, give rise to spaces where moves are proportional to situations. From the game of chess, an aristocratic form of the art of war, which came from China and was brought by the Arabs into medieval Western culture, where it constituted a very important part of manorial culture, to pinochle, lotto, and Scrabble, games formulate, and already formalize, rules organizing moves, and constitute as well a memory, a storage and a classification, of schemas and actions articulating replies with respect to circumstances. They exercise that function precisely because they are detached from those everyday combats which forbid one to show his hand, and whose stakes, rules, and moves are too complex. The explicitness of the rules is always inversely proportional to the practical engagement involved. If we observe a formalization of tactics in these games, as has been done with respect to the game of Go, or compare to games the technique of divination, whose formal framework has the purpose of adjusting a decision to concrete situations, we gain a preliminary body of material concerning the kinds of rationality proper to the practice of spaces that are closed and historicized by the variability of the events to be treated. To these games correspond accounts of particular games. People tell each other about the hand they had to play the night before, or the slam they made the previous week. These stories represent a succession of combinations among all those that the synchronic organization of a space, of rules, of deals, etc., make possible. They are paradigmatic projections of a choice among these possibilities, a choice corresponding to a particular actualization or enunciation. Like the bridge or chess articles in the New York Times, the stories could be formulated in a special code, thus making it clear that every event is a particular application of the formal framework. But in replaying the games, in telling about them, these accounts record the rules and the moves simultaneously, to be memorized as well as memorable. They are repertories of schemas of action between partners. With the attraction that the element of surprise introduces, these mementos teach the tactics possible within a given social system. Tales and legends seem to have the same role. They are deployed, like games, in a space outside of and isolated from daily competition, that of the past, the marvelous, the original. In that space can thus be revealed, dressed as gods or heroes, the models of good or bad ruses that can be used every day. Moves, not truths, are recounted. One can already find an example of these panoplies of strategies in the work of Propp, a pioneer whose work became a rigidified model for formalist research on folktales. The 400 fabulous tales he had examined were reduced to a fundamental series of functions, the function being the action of a character, defined from the point of view of its signification in the development of the plot. It is not certain, as Aarne noted that the homologizing of these functions is coherent, nor, as both Lévi-Strauss and Greimas have shown, that the units Propp delimited are stable. But the novelty of Propp's work, which remains important today, lies in the analysis of the tactics for which the tales offer both an inventory and a repertory of combinations, on the basis of elementary units which are not significations or beings, but actions relative to conflictual situations. With others that have since appeared, Propp's reading would allow us to recognize in the tales the strategic discourses of the people. Hence the privilege that these tales accord to simulation, dissimulation. The formality of everyday practices is indicated in these tales, which frequently reverse the relationships of power and, like the stories of miracles, ensure the victory of the unfortunate in a fabulous utopian space. This space protects the weapons of the weak against the reality of the established order. It also hides them from the social categories which make history because they dominate it. And whereas historiography recounts in the past tense the strategies of instituted powers, these fabulous stories offer their audience a repertory of tactics for future use. Finally, in these tales themselves, the stylistic effects, devices and figures, alliterations, inversions, and plays on words also participate in the collation of these tactics. They are also, more discreetly, living museums of these tactics, the benchmarks of an apprenticeship. Both rhetoric and everyday practices can be defined as internal manipulations of a system, that of language or that of an established order. Turns, or tropes, inscribe in ordinary language the ruses, displacements, ellipses, etc., that scientific reason has eliminated from operational discourses in order to constitute proper meanings. But the practice of these ruses, the memory of a culture, remains in these literary zones into which they have been repressed, as in dreams, where Freud rediscovered them. These tricks characterize a popular art of speaking. So quick, so perspicacious in recognizing them in the discourse of the raconteur and the peddler, the ear of the peasant or worker can discern in a way of speaking, a way of treating the received language. His amused or artistic appreciation also concerns an art of living in the other's field. It distinguishes in these linguistic turns a style of thought and action, that is, models of practice. A diversionary practice, la perruque. With these examples of terrains on which one can locate the specific modalities of enunciative practices, manipulations of imposed spaces, tactics relative to particular situations, the possibility is opened up of analyzing the immense field of an art of practice, differing from the models that, in theory, reign from top to bottom, in a culture certified by education, from the universities to the elementary schools, models that all postulate the constitution of a space of their own, a scientific space or a blank page to be written on, independent of speakers and circumstances, in which they can construct a system based on rules, ensuring the system's production, repetition, and verification. Two questions burden this inquiry. They concern, moreover, the two sides of a single political problem. First, on what grounds can we call this art different? Second, from what position, from what distinct place, can we set out to analyze it? Perhaps by resorting to the very procedures of this art, we can revise our views on both its definition as popular and our position as observers. To be sure, there remain social, economic, historical differences between the practitioners, peasants, workers, etc., of these ruses, and ourselves as analysts. It is no accident that their culture is elaborated in terms of the conflictual or competitive relations between the stronger and the weaker, leaving no room for a legendary or ritual space that would be merely neutral. This difference can, moreover, be seen within the study itself, in the gap that separates the time of solidarity, marked by docility and gratitude toward one's hosts, from the time of writing. The latter reveals the institutional affiliations, scientific, social, and the profit, intellectual, professional, financial, etc., for which this hospitality is objectively the means. The Bororos of Brazil sink slowly into their collective death, and Lévi-Strauss takes a seat in the French Academy. Even if this injustice disturbs him, the facts remain unchanged. This story is ours as much as his. In this one respect, which is an index of others that are more important, the intellectuals are still born on the backs of the common people. We need not stress here either the socio-economic implications or the locus of ethnological or historical research, or the political situation that, from the very beginning of contemporary research, has inscribed the concept popular in a problematics of repression. But one pressing question must be confronted here. If one does not expect a revolution to transform the laws of history, how is it possible to foil, here and now, the social hierarchization which organizes scientific work on popular cultures and repeats itself in that work? The resurgence of popular practices within industrial and scientific modernity indicates the paths that might be taken by a transformation of the object of our study and the place from which we study it. The operational models of popular culture cannot be confined to the past, the countryside, or primitive peoples. They exist in the heart of the strongholds of the contemporary economy. Take, for example, what in France is called la perruque, the wig. La perruque is the worker's own work disguised as work for his employer. It differs from pilfering in that nothing of material value is stolen. It differs from absenteeism in that the worker is officially on the job. La perruque may be as simple a matter as a secretary's writing a love letter on company time, or as complex as a cabinet maker's borrowing a lathe to make a piece of furniture for his living room. Under different names in different countries, this phenomenon is becoming more and more general, even if managers penalize it or turn a blind eye on it in order not to know about it. Accused of stealing or turning material to his own ends and using the machines for his own profit, the worker who indulges in la perruque actually diverts time, not goods, since he uses only scraps, from the factory for work that is free, creative, and precisely not directed toward profit. In the very place where the machine he must serve reigns supreme, he cunningly takes pleasure in finding a way to create gratuitous products whose sole purpose is to signify his own capabilities through his work, and to confirm his solidarity with other workers, or his family, through spending his time in this way. With the complicity of other workers, who thus defeat the competition the factory tries to instill among them, he succeeds in putting one over on the established order on its home ground. Far from being a regression toward a mode of production organized around artisans or individuals, la perruque reintroduces popular techniques of other times and other places into the industrial space, that is, into the present order. Many other examples would show the constant presence of these practices in the most ordered spheres of modern life. With variations, practices analogous to la perruque are proliferating in governmental and commercial offices as well as in factories. No doubt they are just as widespread as formerly, though they ought still to be studied, just as widely suspected, repressed, or ignored. Not only workshops and offices, but also museums and learned journals penalize such practices or ignore them. The authority of ethnological or folklore studies permits some of the material or linguistic objects of these practices to be collected, labeled according to place of origin and theme, put in display cases, offered for inspection and interpretation, and thus that authority conceals, as rural treasures serving to edify or satisfy the curiosity of city folk, the legitimization of an order supposed by its conservators to be immemorial and natural. Or else they use the tools and products taken from a language of social operations to set off a display of technical gadgets, and thus arrange them, inert, on the margins of a system that itself remains intact. The actual order of things is precisely what popular tactics turn to their own ends, without any illusion that it will change anytime soon. Though elsewhere it is exploited by a dominant power or simply denied by an ideological discourse, here order is tricked by an art. Into the institution to be served are thus insinuated styles of social exchange, technical invention, and moral resistance, that is, an economy of the gift, generosities for which one expects a return, an aesthetics of tricks, artists' operations, and an ethics of tenacity, countless ways of refusing to accord the established order the status of a law, a meaning, or a fatality. Popular culture is precisely that. It is not a corpus considered as foreign, fragmented in order to be displayed, studied, and quoted by a system which does to objects what it does to living beings. The progressive partitioning of times and places, the disjunctive logic of specialization through and for art, no longer has an adequate counterpart in the conjunctive rituals of mass communications. This fact cannot become our law. It can be gotten around through departments that, competing with the gifts of our benefactors, offer them products at the expense of the institution that divides and pays the workers. This practice of economic diversion is in reality the return of a socio-political ethics into an economic system. It is no doubt related to the potlatch described by Mauss, an interplay of voluntary allowances that counts on reciprocity and organizes a social network articulated by the obligation to give. In our societies, the market economy is no longer determined by such an emulation. Taking the abstract individual as a basic unit, it regulates all exchanges among these units according to the code of generalized equivalence constituted by money. This individualistic axiom is, of course, now surfacing as the question that disturbs the free market system as a whole. The a priori assumption of an historical Western option is becoming its point of implosion. However that may be, the potlatch seems to persist within it as the mark of another type of economy. It survives in our economy, though on its margins or in its interstices. It is even developing, although held to be illegitimate, within modern market economy. Because of this, the politics of the gift also becomes a diversionary tactic. In the same way, the loss that was voluntary in a gift economy is transformed into a transgression in a profit economy. It appears as an excess, a waste, a challenge, a rejection of profit, or a crime, an attack on property. This path, relative to our economy, derives from another. It compensates for the first, even though it is illegal and, from this point of view, marginal. The same pathway allows investigations to take up a position that is no longer defined only by an acquired power and an observational knowledge, with the addition of a pinch of nostalgia. Melancholy is not enough. Certainly, with respect to the sort of writing that separates domains in the name of the division of labor and reveals class affiliations, it would be fabulous if, as in the stories of miracles, the groups that formerly gave us our masters, and that are currently lodged in our corpus, were to rise up and themselves mark their comings and goings in the texts that honor and bury them at the same time. This hope has disappeared, along with the beliefs which have long since vanished from our cities. There are no longer any ghosts who can remind the living of reciprocity. But in the order organized by the power of knowledge, ours, as in the order of the countryside or the factories, a diversionary practice remains possible. Let us try to make a perruque in the economic system whose rules and hierarchies are repeated, as always, in scientific institutions. In the area of scientific research, which defines the current order of knowledge, working with its machines and making use of its scraps, we can divert the time owed to the institution. We can make textual objects that signify an art and solidarities. We can play the game of free exchange, even if it is penalized by bosses and colleagues when they are not willing to turn a blind eye on it. We can create networks of connivances and sleights of hand. We can exchange gifts, and in these ways we can subvert the law that, in the scientific factory, puts work at the service of the machine, and, by a similar logic, progressively destroys the requirement of creation and the obligation to give. I know of investigators experienced in this art of diversion, which is a return of the ethical, of pleasure, and of invention within the scientific institution. Realizing no profit. Profit is produced by work done for the factory, and often at a loss. They take something from the order of knowledge in order to inscribe artistic achievements on it, and to carve on it the graffiti of their debts of honor. To deal with everyday tactics in this way would be to practice an ordinary art, to find oneself in the common situation, and to make a kind of perruque of writing itself.